Hello out there in Extinction Radio Land. It is Peter Melton joining you again today to have a conversation with yet another powerful and wonderful leader in the new thoughts that are surrounding our current predicaments. And today we get to speak to Peter Russell. Welcome, Peter.
Hi, nice to be with you, Peter. Two Peters.
Yeah, two Peters, two peas in a pod. Just daring to talk about and feel into this amazing moment we find ourselves in. I first became aware of Peter Russell in 1994. I went to a personal growth workshop, and they played your video, The Global Brain, which dared to talk about how we're all connected and how consciousness is all connected and so much more than that. And well, you've gone on to write, I think, 10 or more books on how we're all connected in evolution and consciousness. Give us a little flavor in a few minutes of how you got into this passion and what you've been up to for your life.
Right. Well, very briefly, I started off as a scientist, or scientist-minded. I studied mathematics at university at Cambridge in England, and then moved into theoretical physics, partly because I was good at it and also loved it and was absolutely fascinated by what physics was showing. This is back in the 60s. And yet at the same time, always had a background interest in the mind and consciousness. And there came a time when I realized that however much physics I would do, it would never really explain why there was consciousness, why we were conscious and what consciousness was all about. And so I moved more into, first of all, into psychology, experimental psychology, studying the brain, thinking that would help me understand more about the mind. But then realized that the people who really were studying the mind were people actually exploring consciousness firsthand, which means, sitting in meditation, exploring one's own mind. And that led me to an interest in Indian philosophy and meditation in particular. So I started meditating, which initially was TM. This was back in the late 60s. And went out to India, study meditation more. And that was a sort of turning point when I realized there was something to spirituality. As a sort of teenager, I'd rejected religion totally. It's just a load of weird Stone Age mumbo-jumbo. And yeah, it just didn't make sense, just a load of sort of weird belief systems. But realizing there was something at the heart of all the spiritual traditions, which I got fascinated by, which was about human consciousness and how we get trapped in self-centered, materialistic thinking, and different paths and ways to free ourselves from that. And also seeing that was really one of the primary causes of so many of the problems we were facing in the world today was basically human greed, human self-centeredness, human thinking, poor decision-making, short-term thinking on the part of humans. And so if we were going to improve our lot, it was clear we also needed to be working on freeing our consciousness from outdated beliefs, mindsets, attitudes, and particularly from the more egocentric way of functioning. And that's really been, I suppose, the main part of my life. The main thread has been around that, looking at that, exploring that personally, just getting closer and closer to understanding what is that essential thread. And, in the books you talk about communicating that in my books in various ways to just put that message out there. And I think through all of this, back in my teenage years as a mathematician, I got fascinated by exponential change, exponential curves, and how we cannot think in exponential terms. We only think in very linear terms. And that was, even my first book, I was venturing into that, saying we cannot comprehend or really imagine the future because we can't think in exponential terms. And that's been a thread, say, really through my life looking at that, and just more recently, the last few years, really been coming back to that a lot and looking at the implications of exponential change for the long-term future of humanity, or rather seeing that it actually means there probably is no long-term future for humanity, that change is going to keep on increasing faster and faster, and the stress of that is going to lead to great unraveling of our culture.
Yeah, and that's really I heard you do an interview with Deb Ozarko. So folks, if you haven't connected with Deb Ozarko's message yet, go to debozarko.com. She did an amazing interview with you that really sparked my desire to reconnect with you. And it's been great. We got to be on a panel together in San Francisco a couple of weeks ago, and now we get to do this. I'm really drawn to wanting to share your perspective here. Obviously, a lifetime, 50 years maybe or knocking on 50 years worth of feeling into and exploring and studying all these different angles to figure out who are we and what are we doing here, right?
Yeah. And
you started talking about our inability to see or feel relate to exponential change, and I know you have a new article you wrote called Blind Spot that really focuses on that aspect.
Yes. And I suppose what the blind spot refers to is a blind spot on thinking about the future, that whenever we think about the long-term future, we implicitly assume that change is going to be relatively slow, or maybe even at today's rates of change. But if that's the case, then the future is going to be changing very fast. But what is also very clear is that the rate of change is accelerating. Everybody's talking about that. It goes back to Moore's law in computing, but I see it going back much further throughout the whole of evolution, that the rate of change is getting faster and faster and faster. And that is absolutely inevitable. And so, 10 years from now, the rate of change is going to be much faster than it is now. Another 10 years above that, it's going to be even faster. So the rate of change is set to keep on increasing. And that's just a natural part of any evolutionary process in which there's positive feedback, which means what currently has been established facilitates future development. And we're seeing that today with computer technology and the internet. It's all helping speed things up. So it seems absolutely inevitable that change, over the next 10, 20, 30 years, 40 years is going to get faster and faster and faster. And people talk about, the technological singularity when we have computers as smart as human beings, and they'll just push the rate of change even faster. And so we have these two views of the future, which are actually incompatible. Accelerating change says things are going to reach astronomical rates of change within decades, probably intolerable rates of change. And then our sort of naive view of the future, which is without acceleration. If you take any sort of model of the future, 100, 200, 300, 1,000, few thousand years out, none of them include accelerating change. And this is what I see as our blind spot. Accelerating change is here to stay, and yet when we think of the future, we do not set our models of the future in terms of accelerating change.
Yeah, that's so well said and concise. You're reframing a lot of different things that even in this little genre we have here on Extinction Radio, where we're daring to look at what accelerated change might look like, in particular with climate, but also population and also technology and just all the variables that tie in. And so first I want to touch base with something that you shared in one of your interviews about how even way back in the 70s, you were working with Shell Oil and not only helping them with meditation and finding some peace that way, but there was also these systems that you would run, these future prognosis way back then in the 70s about what happens if things just fly off the handle.
Yes, that was Shell did. They have this cycle every 3 years. They take a 3-year study of the future 25 years out, future scenario building, and I was invited to join one of those discussions. This was back in the early 90s, and at the time we were looking at the consequences 25 years out of the collapse of the Berlin Wall and Russia, the USSR, and underneath the table was this scenario that everybody agreed was possible, but no one actually dared put it forward to the board of Shell because it wasn't very useful, and that was, maybe it's too late, maybe we've blown it, and things are just going to sort of fall apart. But we called that scenario X. We had scenario A and B, and then under the table we had scenario X, which we all discussed, but didn't dare. It wasn't, that's not useful to the board of a multinational to think that way. They want to think, if it goes this way, do we build a refinery in Venezuela or not? So then it was just a year or two later. I was on my own. I was on a lecture tour around the States and found myself saying, well, if we just raise our consciousness, transcend our ego, extinct it, etc. These being, as I was saying earlier, the root cause of our problems. If we can remedy the root cause, then we can, that's the key to dealing with our problems, and we can get things back on track. And I realized that, inside there was a bit of me which was feeling I didn't quite believe that. And so I sat down one evening to look at that and realized several things. I mean, first of all, here am I, an individual who's been, focused on my own development, awakening for many years. Am I a fully liberated, awakened, enlightened being? No way. I may be a little more on that path, but, so, and then there's, I'm one in 1,000 people who are actually deliberately looking at that. So, seeing the chances of humanity as a whole making this consciousness transition seem very, very slim. And even if we did, then what we've unleashed in terms of climate change, pollution, other things, they're not going to suddenly go away, and so we're still going to have massive problems. So I started entertaining scenario X. What does this actually mean if things are just going to be falling apart and there's no way to avoid it? And I realized what's going to be needed then is greater. There's going to be a lot of suffering. We're going to need to have, compassion, care. We need to let go of our fixed ways of thinking about things or how we've done things in the past. We need to be more flexible in our thinking, but also develop greater stability in ourselves, not to be thrown around by events so much. And I realized that this was exactly the same things we needed to develop as if we were going to shift our consciousness and save the world. And that was a sort of turning point for me, because I realized whatever path the world was going to take, the work, the inner work was the same work. And so there was a freedom there from, doing the work in order to save the world. It didn't really matter. The work was the same work of basically awakening of consciousness, to put it simply.
Right. Wow. So you have such a unique way of reframing evolution, extinction, this human adventure. So I want to start you off and have you go. You were in another interview I was hearing you talk about, the world has gone on for billions of years, 99.999 percent of its life without us, and then we just show up here for this flash in cosmic time, and how can we hold, knowing what we know now, or think we know, I guess, that consciousness flowers in the way that it does, and that all of the universe as we know it is just even still a moment in the grander infinite story. And you make a parallel to a flower. Tell us about your parallel to a flower.
Right. Well, I mean, there's several things here. Yes, as you say, I mean, I see, human beings, we're just this flash in time. And it's like there's a blossoming of consciousness, which, I mean, first of all, I believe all creatures are conscious. I believe consciousness is a universal aspect of all living systems. But what happens is once or twice or something in the planet's history, very occasionally, a creature arises basically with two things: language, intelligence, language, the ability to understand the world, and also technology, tools, technology. And when that happens, the acceleration just takes off. And it took us, hundreds of thousands of years evolving, very simple stone tools, and then it took tens of thousands, and things got faster and faster and faster. This is an inevitable consequence of this blossoming of consciousness. And in that blossoming of consciousness, there's a whole understanding of the world that happens. It's science, there's philosophy, spirituality, which is really, you could say, an understanding of ourselves, reflection on understanding who we are. We can begin to think about things. We perform, great art. We get creative, and scientific endeavors. We begin to study the world around us and begin to understand how it works. There's this whole blossoming of consciousness that happens, which is fueled by these two things of intelligence, language, that whole thing, the inner processing, and tools, the ability to process the world out there. And this inevitably makes this blossoming go faster and faster and faster. And that's what we're seeing today in the acceleration. And what I see is that, as I said earlier, that's inevitable, which the acceleration's inevitable, and it comes to an end. And it comes to an end because of the stress in the system. As things go faster and faster, things have to adapt more. And stress is basically failure to adapt. And so what we're seeing as climate change today is the fact that the planet cannot accommodate the amount of CO2 we're producing fast enough. We're producing CO2 thousands of times faster than the planet could absorb it. In the past, it was in balance, but now that's a failure to adapt. The planetary ecosystem is a failure to adapt to humanity. And I see many other examples of this, and that failure to adapt leads to breakdown eventually. And so I see ultimately this blossoming of consciousness, this incredible thing that happens, brings with it its own inevitable end in a very short time. That's why it happens in a flash, and then it's over. And people this is where people get all upset. It's like, oh my God, we're going to be extinct. And I think, no, this is what happens. This is what happens on a planet when you have intelligence like this, consciousness like this, and you have this blossoming of consciousness. And it's like a flower. And I think of it, the particular flower I like to think of is the so-called century plant, which is, I think it's an agave plant, which blossoms once every 18 or 20 years and then dies. And we watch the whole thing growing, and then I saw one last week, and then suddenly it just blossoms in this incredible fluorescence of petals and flowers, and then it dies. But we don't mourn the fact that it's gone. We accept that these plants last 18 years, and that's it. And I was marveling at this thing, that this growth of this flower, suddenly it puts up this stalk 10, 15 feet high, and this whole tree of flowers. And it does this, and we marvel at that. And we accept the fact that that's it. And my feeling is that's what happens with the blossoming of consciousness. It's inevitable. It cannot last. It cannot last. In a way, it consumes its own biological infrastructure. It cannot last. But instead of saying, oh my God, we're going to become extinct, it's like, no, this is what happens, and we should be celebrating the incredible species that we are in this, what we've achieved, what we can do in this moment, and knowing that we probably won't be here 50, 100 years' time. But you see, in the same way we accept our own death, each of us is a blossoming of consciousness. We're an individual blossoming of consciousness. And we know that 100 years after our birth, within that 100 years, for most people, some people a bit longer, it's going to come to an end. But we don't go and say, oh my God, I'm going to die, isn't this awful? I'm going to die, what can we do about it? We accept it. And I'm feeling the same way we need to accept that this is what happens when this blossoming of consciousness occurs. We need to accept it's something that happens in a flash of evolutionary time and then is over. And we need to let go of the idea that we should be around for thousands of years or millions of years, and we need to save ourselves. So that's how I see it. And what's fascinating is once I started seeing it that way, there was this sense of relief that came. It's like, yeah, this is how things are. And I'm finding that, people who read my blind spot paper, a lot of them say the same thing. It's like, I always felt something like this, but I never quite dared admit it to myself. And when I do, then I feel this sense of ease and relief about it. Not everybody. Other people think, oh my God, there's something wrong with this. You're saying we're going to become extinct, and we mustn't let this happen. And I feel there's nothing we can do about it. This is just what happens.
Right. Just as we're so clear that a death of a person or any animal and any plant, we know they're going to die, but kind of almost another blind spot we've created is we don't want to look at that, right? We don't want to incorporate the fact that I'm going to die into the fact that I'm alive, but that's what this moment is pushing forth onto us.
Exactly. And just as it, so many, spiritual teachings and just humanistic teachings say it's really important that we accept our own mortality, that can be healing, it can be a spiritual opening to accept our own mortality. And there's some traditions, like some Buddhist traditions where people, spend hours meditating in graveyards, accepting their own mortality. I think that acceptance is actually a healthy thing rather than denying it. And when an individual dies, and I just had this recently with the loss of a parent, it's like there is the mourning and the grieving of what has been lost, and yet at the same time there's so much opportunity for celebration of the life and gratitude for the life and love of the people and who they were. And that's part of what we do in a memorial or a wake, is like we celebrate the person as well as the grieving that they're no longer here. We celebrate everything that they were. So I'm feeling we should be, in a way, holding wakes for humanity, saying, wow, we're only here for a short time, but aren't we just an amazing thing to have happened on a planet? Isn't this absolutely amazing what we are now? Let go of whether or not we're going to be here in the long-term future. Let go of that, holding on to that, and just really celebrate this incredible being that we are and all that we've achieved.
I'm feeling from inside the flower, we're basically asking the flower to celebrate itself, in that 20-year span you experienced, because here we are inside the beast that is flowering, while at the same time we have this chance to be aware of ourselves as the flower, and in urging us to look at our own mortality, you're going much further than that. You're urging us to begin to grok that the whole species was never going to last, and that and that maybe even, well, definitely life on Earth isn't going to last forever, although the timeline could likely be dramatically different. But that's what you're daring us to explore.
Exactly, and I think life on Earth is going to continue. There's going to be a major. It's clear we're in the sixth major species extinction, and there's probably no avoiding that, and a lot of the other higher mammals and life forms will probably become extinct, but life will rebound. 5-10 million years time, it'll be off again. Life will rebound. I'm not worried about that at all. But yes, it's about accepting that this is the way it is, and almost rejoicing in ourselves.
Yeah, and that extinction, broadening the definition of extinction, because, you asked me what extinction is. It's like, well, the last animal, the last being dies and there's no more and that's it. But you're creating a whole different reframing for extinction.
Yeah, and I don't like the word extinction. It's so loaded, like there's something bad about it. And I'm saying, no, this is what happens. A flower blossoms and it goes. We are this blossom. And it also means another important aspect of this way of framing it is there's no blame. We didn't go wrong. And I think everybody who's, looking at what's happening, whether it's climate change or resource pollution or, anything that's happening in the world, we put blame. Where did we go wrong? Was it the Industrial Revolution? Was it civilization? Was it agriculture? We always put the blame. And I think there's no blame to be put. All along, basically what we were doing was trying to improve our lot, trying to improve the quality of life, trying to live healthier, longer lives. So there's no blame for that. We just didn't see the consequences. I mean, when we started, burning coal, no one thought what's going to happen to the planet, and they didn't understand anything about carbon dioxide or greenhouse gases. It was just like, this keeps us warmer. This allows us to do more. We can actually make things work better with this way. It's like a way of improving the quality of life, and it did do. So I see there's no blame to be put for where we are, no blame at all. It's like, this is what happens. Just as, if an individual is reaching the end of their life, you don't blame, what did they go wrong, I'm going to die. You don't blame them. You just say, this is what happens. I had this wonderful life, and now it's closing.
Right, just like to go back to the flower, that, instead of extinction radio, we're flowering radio. We're consciousness, the flowering part is happening, and we are aware that once the flowering part happens, then the flower petals start to turn brown, and then they crinkle up, and then they fall off, and that's the end of the game.
Yeah, and accepting that, and there's still so much we can do in the short time left to us. I mean, because things are accelerating, then there's so much more opportunity for change and development. And knowing what's happening, I think we have the opportunity to really wake up. As I was saying in my sort of realization about the scenarios, is there's going to be so much that we're going to be called to do to help each other through this stage. I mean, we are alive, and as things begin to unravel more, there's going to be, hardship, there's going to be pain here, there's going to be suffering, there's going to be lots of things to be taken care of, but we need to do it with compassion and understanding and flexibility of thinking, and be able to, open up to our inner resources more, not so that we can save the world, but so that we can navigate these closing times with as much grace, humility, and wisdom as we can muster. So there's really an opportunity for us to actually be with these final times in a very, I want to say, grand way, in the true sense, that really become as much as we can be, so that we can still flower to our maximum in this.
Yeah. Wow, exactly. And that's the groundwork, as things start to crumble, as the unraveling happens, and who we thought we were gets torn to shreds. We're going to find ourselves landing on whatever it is, our deeper belief of what humanity is, what life is, this process we're talking about, this flowering. And if we can land, if a person could land on this thing that says, wow, I really was a 20-year flower, and I'm flowering right now, and then it's over, and that's the way it was, then we have a better chance to experience ourselves and others in this grand way.
Yeah, and it's going to be challenging, and we're all going to pass away sooner or later, and that journey may be a little rougher or more unexpected than we thought it was going to be, but we're still here, and we're still human beings, and how do we care for each other as we move through this, and care for ourselves, and live through these changes wisely?
Yeah. I use the phrase, I want to know myself beyond my humanity while I'm still here. Mm-hmm. And I think you've really framed that, the flower reference, and reframing extinction and death into just so much more clearly into the whole story of who we are, that it's not a bad thing, that we're not a species gone wrong, but that when it flowers like this, it flowers like this.
Yes, exactly. We're not a species gone wrong. We're an incredible flowering of consciousness which happens just occasionally, and then when it does, it's just like this. It's so rapid, and yeah.
Mm. It gets to the point where words just can't do it anymore. Yeah. Wow. Well, thank you so much for your years and years of daring to explore this and finding this place, and really for this moment to create a metaphor that really fits for me, that we are flowers, we are flowering. Whoosh. And it's time to, as you say in Blind Spot, exit with grace, that we're in that moment where it's celebration time. like you mentioned, the wake after someone dies, it's a celebration that goes with the grief and with all the feelings. But that moment is, oh my God, I got to experience this person. I got to have this person in my world, and that's where we are as a species,
It's almost to rejoice in ourselves.
Yeah, and that we're waking up in a whole different way. The pun of the word wake, where we are waking up to the wake, to the celebration of who we are.
Yeah.
And who we've always been, and, well, I dare to ask, who we will continue to be. What is your perspective on what goes beyond? What does the great beyond have in store?
You mean beyond our individual lives?
Yep.
I have no idea.
Oh, come on. I have no idea.
Well, I mean, lots of people have their beliefs. You mean what happens when we die?
I guess, yeah. It depends what we think we are. But if we think we are life flowering, then when the flower dies, the life is that consciousness life. What happens with it?
Yeah. I mean, when I say I don't know, I don't find any particular theory of heaven, reincarnation, or whatever. There's so many different models out there. It's like, first of all, you've got to choose which one you're going to believe in, and then any particular belief has its problems. So that's why I say I don't know.
Yeah.
If I have to lean anywhere, I think, ultimately, each of us is part of a universal field of consciousness, and like we are a droplet of that consciousness. Or as often in metaphysical teachings, they say we're like a wave on the ocean, and the wave is composed of water, and we are like an individual wave that has its own energy, its own shape, its own life. But when that wave sort of falls back into the ocean, it's like it dissolves, but the water of the wave is still the water of the ocean. And it's like our true nature, which is just that beingness, that pure consciousness, which is really that sense, that deep sense of being an aware being, that knowing our experience, that deep, deep sense of presence in us all. I think we dissolve back into that which is beyond any sense of individuality. So I think our sense of individuality, which is something that's built up during this life, when this life ends, that dissolves. And I think a lot of the beliefs about the future are people wanting to hold on to the individuality. My sense of individuality is going to continue in some way, whether it's in some heaven, some afterlife, or some new reincarnation. It's all about my individuality continuing. I think our individuality dissolves, but our essence, it's almost like our essence returns to the universal essence. And that, and that's something, I mean, in Indian teachings, they say, death is the Maha Samadhi, the great Samadhi. Samadhi is, in meditation or, in life is when we drop our sense of individuality and reconnect with our true nature. We do that while we're alive. And they say almost like reconnecting with our true nature while we're alive is practice for doing that when the body finally stops working. When we enter the great Samadhi, the great return to our source.
Right, to the place we never left.
Yeah.
Right, I often use the ocean and wave metaphor. In fact, I wrote a little fable. I'll send you a version of it called Waves of Oneness. That as I know myself as the ocean expressing, and then I trick myself for this flash of time into thinking I'm an individual wave.
Yeah.
And go through all the fears of separation just for the fun of it, because the ocean knows that the ocean lives on, but the wave gets to have this virtual reality for a moment, and then it gets to quote unquote die,
right? And
then remember that it was the ocean all along, and that also speaks to the fact that we're all connected in the fact that perhaps we're all consciousness expressing as all these zillions of individual essences for a temporary moment, and the infinite ocean gets to experience the finite wave at the same paradoxical time.
Yeah, yeah. And as you say, it's a place we never left, but it's a place we have forgotten,
Yes.
or we're not in touch with, because our attention is out there in the world doing things, or it's in our thoughts or our fantasies or in our imagination. Our attention is always directed out onto something, and we forget, or rather do not recognize that which is attending, the consciousness which is our true nature, which is that which is knowing all these different experiences, which is knowing our thoughts. And that's why when we let the mind become still, we just drop back into that which we never left, but which we had not recognized. We just drop back into that which we never left. And that's why I think, the essence of spiritual practice is really finding ways to allow that to happen, to just drop back into our true nature and recognize we are that consciousness. That is what we are, is consciousness. And that which is observing all that this particular individual body-mind is experiencing.
Yes, the magic of the universe, cleverly disguised as Peter and Peter having a chat on Extinction Radio.
Right. Yeah.
Wow. Well, there we are. We summed it all up. We got it all figured out now. Until we go outside and we got a parking ticket or something, and then we're thrown for a looper again.
That's it. We got to deal with the world, and the world is going to get more unpredictable, more and more unpredictable, more chaotic. And we need to recognize that and accept it, and rather than thinking it's going to get better at some stage, is really no, it's going to get more and more chaotic.
And call on us to go more and more into that knowing, that deeper knowingness of ourselves, so that when the chaos is in front of us, we can land in some kind of grounded presence of knowing who we are beyond this body and these circumstances.
Absolutely.
Wow.
Yeah.
Peter, what a treat. And we were on that panel, and the video of the panel will be coming out soon, so folks, you can keep an eye out for that. I'll be sure to share it on the Extinction Radio Facebook page, but also your website is peterrussell.com, correct?
Yes, peterrussell.com with 2 L's on the Russell, not the French way of spelling it. So Peter Russell, 2 S's, 2 L's.com. And then there on the homepage, you can see a link to the Blind Spot article, which is a long essay sort of expanding in much more detail what we've been talking about today.
Yeah, and I know you got plenty of YouTube videos there too, in all your fields that we discussed there, the consciousness, but also the meditation and the quest for self and just all that. So folks, if you liked what you heard there, go check out some more. And again, Peter, thank you so much for your time. Pleasure to reconnect and dance with you.
Yeah, really enjoyed it. Thank you.
All right. Be well, my friend.